You walk into the middle of a scream. It is not the sudden, cinematic scream meant to startle. It is the long, animal arc of a world tearing its seams, a sound worn thin by weather and waiting, like a bone that finally snaps under the slow weight of time. Imagine the howl of a winter wind pressed through a dozen broken windows. Imagine a voice folded and re-folded into itself until what remains is only the shape of something once human. That is where this story begins, in a cabin, and breathed cold and bitterness, and beneath the floorboards. A history so crowded with its own shadow that the sunlight refused to rest there for long. On the doorstep, rime collects on an old biscuit tin, and inside the tin, a child's buttons lie fused to rust. There is a smell, not just of wet wood and coal smoke, but of things that resist naming a sweetness gone wrong. The cloying iron of old blood, the sour ash of prayers no one kept. When men finally pried that door open, their boots sank into a mat of straw hair, and something softer, they found children's toys abandoned in a circle. Their paint flaked away like dried skin. The children were there, but they were also not. Some lay almost asleep. Faces slack with fevers that had become companion, others huddled like birds who had forgotten how to fly. Listen close, and you can hear the record scratching. The county ledger, the coroner's private note, the inked ledger of a midwife who wrote with her hand trembling. These are not fanciful stories passed by the fireside. They are records, signatures stamped on brittle paper, numbers assigned to births and deaths, the clenched, bureaucratic language that tries and fails to contain calamity. The government has a way of codifying ruin. It writes it down as if the act of writing alone might cleanse it. In this place, the ink only made the stain worse. The family who lived there had been pushed to the edge the way old trees splay their roots when the earth begins to slide. Their names are still in the courthouse ledgers, but in the valley where the cabin stood, people speak of them. In the hush of people who have learned silence is the only shelter. They were a family that did not resemble the ordered line of a tree. Their branches curled back upon one another, grafting where growth should have separated. The house, once a small, stubborn thing of clapboard and smoke, grew inward until it became a cavern of private rights, a hermitage of excused acts. There were two women who stood at the center of that clustered life. They moved like twin shadows, neither quite older than the other in the way that kinship warps the passage of time. One made vows with a smile that hid hunger. The other gave herself in ways that could not be named in public and, over years, in private, convinced herself and those around her that what they did was right because it kept them together. Between them stood the man who would be called husband and father. Though those titles would mean different things in the house than they did in the county records. Outside, the lane ended at the mine road. Inside, the lane disappeared entirely, swallowed by rules written only in the family's own manner of looking at one another. There was a promise, sealed one cold spring, made in a voice that was both a blessing and a threat. It is the kind of promise that does not admit nuance. It bends futures into a single, narrow course. What followed that promise was not a fast descent, but an erosion that took years to complete. It was slow and patient as moss, and it left children crooked, names crossed, and papers that would one day be opened like old wounds. Continue. Which city are you watching from? And what time is it right now? The air here does not move easily. It hangs thick in the hollows, weighted by decades of unspoken things. Eastern Tennessee, 1911. Though the maps will tell you it was once part of North Carolina, before the borders were redrawn by surveyors who couldn't bear the terrain. They called it Vesper County, after the evening prayer, though no church ever took root here. The mountains do not welcome hymns, they swallow them. At the time, coal seams had begun to tempt men westward, cutting roads through forests that had never known an axe. Those who stayed behind did so by choice, or by shame. The valley was a natural bowl, ringed in shale cliffs, where fog lingered like the ghost of an old sea. Houses clung to its slopes like scabs, their chimneys coughing black smoke into the mist. There was no post office, no schoolhouse, no doctor save for an old woman who traded poultices for silence. The families who settled there had names older than the towns themselves. They intermarried the way roots entangle, not from sin or desire, but because there was no one else. Bloodlines folded inward until surnames became unnecessary. Everyone was cousin to everyone else, and it was better not to ask how close. In that closed circle lived the Crenshaw family, 5 generations on the same plot of land, their graves marking the slow descent from farmers to something unrecognizable. The patriarch, Elias Crenshaw, had arrived in 1879 with a wife already carrying their first child. The county survey notes mention his name only once, in reference to a land grant dispute, but the handwritten margin beside it, in a different pen and a different hand, reads simply, Crenshaw line should have ended there. By 1911, Elias was long dead, buried beneath a stone so worn the letters had dissolved into cracks. But his descendants still lived on the property, 4 adults, 2 children, and 1 infant born just as the coal road reached the edge of their land. That infant was said to have been born under a blood moon, the kind that stains the night with a slow, rust-colored light. Midwife records list her as female, living unnamed. The Crenshaws would call her Ruth. It is difficult to describe Ruth without sounding like one is repeating superstition. She grew quickly, too quickly, and not evenly. Her eyes were mismatched in color, one gray and one near black, and her hair came in white at the crown, dark at the tips. Neighbors who visited said she never cried as a baby, only watched, as if she were studying them with the patience of someone much older. The old woman who delivered her later refused payment, saying she wanted no part in whatever had come through that child. There were whispers that Elias had not left this world quietly, that his death was neither natural nor final. Locals spoke of lights in the Crenshaw field at night, of strange humming carried through the wind. Those who passed by after dark swore they heard a lullaby drifting from the barn, sung in a voice too low to belong to any living child. The county clerk tried to file a census in 1912, but no one in the valley would open their doors. The Crenshaws signed their forms in smudged pencil, listing no occupations, no schooling, and under relation, the same word repeated, family. That word would become both their defense and their undoing. In the winter that followed, one of the boys from the coal camp disappeared while walking home. The search party found his hat beside the river, and next to it, a small carving made from bone, shaped like a sleeping infant. No one went near the Crenshaw property after that. But in the early spring, travelers on the mining road began to see a pale figure watching from the trees, her white hair catching the light like frost. They said it was Ruth, and they said she never blinked. By the time Ruth could walk, the valley had learned not to speak her name aloud. Children were warned to turn their eyes if they saw her near the fence line. Adults spoke of her only after sundown, and only in the tones reserved for the unburied dead. The Crenshaw cabin sat half a mile from the old river road. a sagging structure of split oak and tar paper that seemed to lean toward the earth, as though ashamed to be upright. Smoke rose from its chimney even in the heat of summer, and those who dared approach said the air around it tasted like pennies. Inside lived the remnants of a family that had forgotten how to divide itself. There was Ruth, her mother Clara, her uncle who was also her father, and a grandmother whose mind had been consumed by the murmuring voices of the hills. Ruth did not play as other children did. She collected things. Stones shaped like teeth, nests abandoned mid-building, pieces of broken mirror she found in the creek. When her mother asked her why, she said each one remembered something. Clara laughed at first, until she noticed that when Ruth spoke of remembering, her lips barely moved, as if someone else was speaking through her. One evening, a miner from the next ridge came down to barter for cornmeal. He saw Ruth standing in the doorway, her face hidden in shadow. He swore later that her reflection appeared behind him before she had stepped into the room. He left the valley before dawn, saying the house, 2 hearts beating in it, but only one body. By the autumn of 1917, the Crenshaws were more rumor than people. The war overseas had drawn the young men away, leaving the hills quiet, except for the creak of trees and the faint hum that still drifted from the Crenshaw barn. Hunters passing through claimed the ground around the property was always warmer than the rest of the valley, even under frost. They said they found hoof prints where no livestock had been kept in years. Ruth, now 6, began to carve symbols into the floorboards with a rusted knife. Her mother tried to sand them away, but each morning the marks returned, deeper, sharper, more deliberate. The symbols matched none known to the county minister or the local Cherokee elders. One night, Clara woke to find her daughter sitting upright in bed, whispering a name that no language could hold. When she tried to shake her awake, Ruth's eyes opened, and for a brief instant they were both black, swallowing the lamplight whole. The next morning, the grandmother was gone. The bed was still warm, but the sheets were untouched. They searched the woods for 3 days and found nothing except her rosary tangled in the roots of an ash tree. Ruth carried the beads for weeks, rolling them between her fingers until they turned slick with oil. Then, one night, she buried them under the floorboards, directly beneath where she slept. As winter pressed into the valley, the family's isolation deepened. Their crops failed, their well soared, and Clara began to speak of leaving. But the uncle, a silent man whose eyes mirrored Ruth's too closely to be coincidence, refused. "The blood has to stay," he said. "It has to finish what it started." No one knew what he meant until the spring thaw, when the snow melted enough to reveal what lay behind the barn. 3 small mounds, perfectly aligned, each marked with the same carved symbol Ruth had etched into the cabin floor. The sheriff came once, took one look, and rode away without dismounting. His report, filed weeks later, contained only 7 words. No further inquiry. Family keeps to itself. But the valley did not sleep after that. For months, travelers heard singing from the direction of the Crenshaw farm. Not the voice of a child, but something older, layered, and wrong. It was said the sound made dogs howl and milk curdle, and that those who lingered to listen too long found their own names slipping from memory. And through it all, Ruth kept growing, but not upward, inward. When the thaw came, the earth itself seemed to reject what it had swallowed. The soil around the Crenshaw property buckled and split, pushing up stones that had never seen daylight. Roots twisted out of the ground like limbs, trying to crawl away. Those who passed along the mining road said the trees near the cabin leaned toward it, not away, as though the forest itself were listening. Inside the house, Clara had stopped speaking entirely. Her hair turned white within a single season, and she spent her days staring through the window toward the barn, rocking slowly, muttering prayers that had no beginning and no end. The uncle, the man everyone in the valley knew, was more than an uncle, worked the land alone. Though there was little left to harvest, his hands shook. Sometimes, in the stillness of afternoon, he could be heard arguing with someone who wasn't there. Ruth had begun to draw, not with charcoal or chalk, but with whatever she found, ash, dirt, sometimes blood from her own fingers. The drawings covered the walls of her room, and eventually spread to the hallway. At first they were crude spirals, circles, branching lines. But over time, the shapes became intricate, almost architectural. They looked less like drawings and more like maps. Maps of rooms that did not exist in the house, doorways that opened into nothing, staircases leading nowhere. One night in 1919, a traveling preacher lost his way in the fog and knocked at the Crenshaws' door. Ruth answered. She was 8 now, but her eyes held the fatigue of someone who had already lived a century. The preacher later told townsfolk that she spoke to him not as a child, but as a judge. Calm, measured, asking him if he believed in what grows beneath names. He didn't understand until she smiled and said, "Then you'll hear it too." He left before dawn, carrying only his Bible and a fever that lasted 3 days. When he recovered, his hair had turned gray. He told anyone who would listen that he had seen a family that has mistaken themselves for God. That summer, the valley began to smell of rot. Crows gathered on the Crenshaw roof, in such numbers that their weight snapped the eaves. At night, a light glowed behind the barn slats, red, pulsing rhythmic, as though the building itself had learned to breathe. No one went near it anymore. Even the animals kept their distance. Cattle balked, horses refused to pass the fence line. In September, Clara vanished. No one saw her leave, though neighbors later said they heard singing the night before. 2 voices, one high and one low, woven together in a strange, wordless melody. Ruth and the uncle told anyone who asked that she had gone to visit kin in another county. But the kin they named had been dead for 20 years. After that, the uncle stopped coming into town altogether. He was seen only once more, standing in the field before dawn, digging something into the soil. Some said it was seed. Others said it was bones. And Ruth, she began to change in ways that no one could explain. She didn't seem to age as other children did. Her skin grew pale as candle wax, her voice lower, more deliberate. When she walked through town on the rare occasions, her uncle sent her for supplies. Dogs hid beneath porches, and babies cried. One woman swore that when Ruth passed her window, the glass fogged over from the inside. By 1922, the Crenshaw farm was a place people avoided not out of superstition, but out of instinct. The deep, animal knowledge that some corners of the earth are not meant for human habitation. The valley's preacher began holding extra services, praying for protection against the sickness of inheritance. He told his congregation that sin could take root not just in the soul, but in the blood itself. And in the cabin, Ruth listened through the thin wooden walls as her uncle whispered to the earth. Sometimes she whispered back. By 1924, the valley had gone quiet again. The coal road washed out in spring rains, and no one bothered to rebuild it. Mail stopped arriving, and the sheriff's reports ended with a single line. No need to revisit Crenshaw property. The world, it seemed, had chosen to forget them. The cabin, however, did not forget. The walls absorbed what was spoken inside them. The house smelled of tallow and damp straw, but underneath lay another scent, something older, sour, sweet like decay turned patient. Each board seemed to pulse with the slow rhythm of a heartbeat that wasn't bound to any living chest. Ruth slept little. She claimed the sound kept her awake, that she could hear the walls breathing when the wind stopped. The uncle's mind was unraveling. He would sit by the hearth muttering about her seed beneath the ribs. He said the earth wanted a body to grow through. Sometimes he spoke to the ground as if it were listening, promising it another child, promising that the bloodline would not end. When the neighbors did glimpse him, his skin had taken a waxen sheen, and his eyes looked milked over, as though he had been staring at something too bright for too long. That winter, Ruth began to show signs of illness, though she never coughed or shivered. She only grew still. Her eyes dulled, and her skin, once colorless, took on a faint translucence. The veins beneath her, it mapped themselves like blue rivers. The local midwife, perhaps the only soul brave enough to answer a summons from the farm, arrived and left within the hour. She told no one what she had seen, only that the child isn't dying exactly. She's becoming something else. A week's passed. The uncle's behavior grew stranger. He spoke less, but sang more. Low hymns in no known tongue, rising and falling like the tide. At night, Ruth joined him. Their voices twined, slipping through the cracks in the boards, until the whole house seemed to hum. It was during one of those nights that a miner's son, wandering too far from his camp, swore he saw the barn doors open and a red glow spill across the snow, thick and pulsing like blood under skin. He said he heard two voices become one, and within that single sound, others, a chorus, faint but growing. In early spring, a storm tore through the valley. Lightning struck the ash tree where the grandmother's rosary had been found. The next morning, smoke drifted from the Crenshaw fields. When the miners climbed the ridge, they found the barn burned to its frame, and the uncle nowhere in sight. Only Ruth stood in the doorway of the cabin, untouched by soot, her white hair unbound, her eyes darker than the storm behind her. She said he had gone into the root. No one asked what she meant. After that, Ruth lived alone. The townsfolk convinced themselves she'd move away or starve. But each year someone passing through report seeing a figure by the field, barefoot, digging with her hands. Crops never grew there again, yet the soil stayed freshly turned, as if it were breathing. The valley called it the hunger ground, and still she did not age. A girl on the outside of time, bound by a bloodline that had eaten its own reflection. Sometimes, late at night, those living miles away claimed to hear a woman's voice carried on the wind, singing that same formless hymn that once shook the boards of the Crenshaw cabin. Always the same note, drawn out until it dissolved into silence. Decades pass differently in the holler. Time there does not move forward, it pools, collecting beneath the surface until one careless step sends ripples through what was thought long buried. By 1941, the Crenshaw property was a ruin swallowed by sumac and ivy. The road that once led to it had disappeared beneath years of flood and neglect. Locals told new arrivals to leave it alone, to let the mountain keep what it had taken. But there were always the curious, and curiosity has a way of feeding the old hunger. That winter, a group of surveyors came into the valley to chart potential mining routes for a new company. Among them was a young man named Daniel Muir, a graduate fresh from Knoxville, eager to make a mark. The locals warned him not to follow the old river road, not to cross the narrow wooden bridge where the water still smelled of iron. They told him the land beyond was bad, not for any legal reason, but for reasons older than laws. He laughed, called it superstition, and went anyway. Daniel's first report back to the company was brief. He wrote that he'd found an abandoned homestead, appearing untouched for years. He noted the remnants of a barn, collapsed and charred. He mentioned the smell, sweet and rotten, like fruit left too long in the sun. He said he'd found a well behind the house, sealed with a slab of stone carved in a spiral pattern. He thought it was decoration. The next day's entry was stranger. He wrote that he'd heard singing from inside the cabin, faint but distinct, a woman's voice repeating a melody without words. He assumed it was an echo carried by the valley, until he found footprints in the ash. Bare, small, but pressed deep, as though someone had been standing there moments before. He followed them into the woods, but they ended abruptly at a circle of disturbed earth. When Daniel failed to return, his team went looking. They found his compass 20 yards from the cabin door, its needle spinning uselessly. His maps were scattered across the porch, soaked in rain, the ink blurred into dark stains. There was no sign of him. Only his journal remained, lying open on the hearth as if left deliberately. The last page was a single sentence, scrawled as though written in haste. "The ground breathes here, and it knows my name." After that, the mining company abandoned the project. The valley went silent again. But whispers persisted, of lights seen drifting through the trees, of an unaging girl who walked the property line at dusk, her face white as frost. Hunters claimed to find fresh tracks there after every thaw, though no one had lived on the land for 20 years. The few who dared approach, the cabin described something peculiar. The air around it seemed heavier, as though pressing inward. Birds avoided the trees nearby, and insects lay dead in perfect circles along the porch rail. And inside, on the walls where the fire had blackened the boards, the outlines of drawings remained, spirals, lattices, and roots that intertwined until they became faces. Some said Ruth had died long ago, that what haunted the land was only her echo, the residue of her family's sins. Others swore they'd seen her with their own eyes, unchanged since the year the barn burned. She appeared at the edge of the woods, hands caked in soil, eyes like two polished stones. They said she looked at them not as strangers, but as kin, as if she recognized something familiar in their faces. That spring, a letter arrived at the county office. It was unsigned, the handwriting delicate, almost childlike. It read, "The blood has not ended. The seed is awake. Come see." The letter reached the desk of a young county health investigator named Thomas Harlan in April of 1942. He was new to the post, diligent, skeptical, and proud of his education. The older clerks laughed when he said he planned to visit the Crenshaw place. "That house eats men," one of them muttered. But Thomas believed in procedure, and procedure demanded follow-up. He left at dawn, taking only a lantern, a notebook, and a pistol that had belonged to his father. The road was nearly gone, reclaimed by bramble and roots. His boots filled with mud before he even reached the creek. He found the bridge exactly where the locals said it would be. Its planks slick with moss, the water below black as ink. On the other side, the air changed. The birds stopped calling. Even the wind seemed to slow, moving only when he did. He saw the house, just as the sun dipped behind the ridge, leaning, hollow-eyed, its boards swollen with years of rot. The door hung open. Inside, dust lay so thick it muffled every step, but beneath the dust was something else. Lines, carved deep into the floor, He brushed them clear with his boot. The same spiral pattern the letter bore. The same shape found on the stone sealing the well. He wrote in his notebook. Symbols resemble those of pagan origin, purpose unclear. Then he heard it, faint at first, then stronger. A woman's voice, low and even, humming the same shapeless tune the miners had once described. It came from the field behind the house. Thomas stepped outside. The lantern flame trembled as if disturbed by breath. The field was empty at first glance, only the dark shape of the well at its center. But then, at its edge, a figure moved. A girl in a gray dress, barefoot, hair white against the dusk. She was facing away from him, her hands buried in the soil as if searching for something. He called out. The humming stopped. Slowly, she turned. Her eyes were gray, but within the gray was something shifting, like water catching the moon. She smiled faintly, the way one smiles at a memory. You shouldn't have come alone, she said. Her voice sounded layered, two tones speaking through the same mouth. Thomas took a step back, his hand on the pistol. Are you Ruth Crenshaw? He asked. She tilted her head, considering. That was one of the names, she said. But names don't hold. He wrote nothing more that day. The next entry in his notebook appears to have been written hours later, the handwriting frantic, smeared by rain or sweat. The earth moves. The well is open. I heard them under the stones. They are not dead. When the sheriff's men found his horse wandering near the creek 3 days later, they followed the tracks back to the Crenshaw property. The cabin was empty. The well's stone cover lay shattered in pieces around its rim. Inside the well, only darkness. When they lowered a lamp, the light bent strangely, its reflection twisting, as though the water's surface wasn't flat, but breathing. Thomas Harlan's body was never found. His notebook recovered near the hearth, smelled faintly of sulfur and damp earth. On its last page, in a smaller, neater hand, one that wasn't his, were the words, "The blood is finished, but the root still hungers." After that, the county sealed the records. Officials declared the property condemned. But the miners and their children continued to see the pale girl near the ridge at dusk, still digging, still humming. Some said she was waiting for the next one to come alone. By the time anyone spoke of the Crenshaw land again, the century had turned. The old mining towns were empty shells, the river rerouted, the bridge rotted into the black water. Only hunters and lost hikers came that deep into the hollow now, and they never lingered after dusk. In the autumn of 2003, a pair of anthropology students from the university in Knoxville found the valley on an old map. The records called it Parcel 47B, former agricultural site, condemned 1943. The word condemned caught their attention. They thought they'd document the remains, maybe publish a small paper about Appalachian folk rituals and land abandonment. They didn't know that, in the archives, the folder labeled Crenshaw Property was thinner than it should have been, that half the pages had been quietly removed decades ago. They arrived in mid-October. The air smelled of copper and wet leaves. They pitched their tent near what had once been the foundation of the barn. One of them, Amy, said she could feel the ground vibrating when she pressed her palms to it. Her partner, Marcus, laughed and blamed the echo of distant quarry work. But that night, when he played back their field recorder, there was a low hum under their voices, steady, rhythmic, almost human. They explored the cabin the next morning. The walls were barely standing, but the carvings remained. Spirals, branching roots, patterns that looked like veins. Amy traced one with her finger and said, "It looks like a map." Beneath a layer of soot, they found a single board newer than the others. Marcus pried it loose. Underneath lay a cavity filled with dried flowers, bones of small animals, and a single page from a notebook. The writing was faded, but a few words were still legible. Seed, a root to, breathing, and then, at the bottom, Ruth. They should have left then. But the students were young and curiosity is just another kind of hunger. That night, Amy woke to a sound outside the tent, a slow, wet dragging across the leaves. She thought it was Marcus until she realized he was still beside her, breathing heavily in sleep. She unzipped the flap and saw nothing but fog. Yet when she looked down, there were footprints, bare, small, pressed deep into the earth. They led away from the tent and disappeared into the dark. By dawn, Marcus was gone. No sign of struggle, just his camera, its battery drained though it had been fully charged. The last photo showed the well, its stones slick with dew, and something pale crouched beside it, too blurred to identify. Amy ran until she found the main road. When rescue teams returned with her 2 days later, the well was filled in, carefully, as though someone had packed the soil by hand. The cabin had collapsed overnight, and the carvings were gone, buried beneath splintered wood. They found no trace of Marcus. Amy never returned to school. But before she disappeared from the public eye entirely, she sent one final email to her advisor. Attached was an audio file labeled Field Record 47B, MP3. It was only 3 minutes long. The first 30 seconds were wind and static. Then a faint voice emerged. A girl's voice, distant but clear, humming that same wordless tune. Near the end, the hum deepened, layered with other voices. Hundreds, maybe thousands, all rising from beneath the sound of soil shifting. And finally, one whisper close to the microphone. The blood sleeps, but the root remembers. The email had no signature, only a single line typed below the file. She's still in the field. In the years that followed Amy's disappearance, the Crenshaw story faded once more, not forgotten, but buried beneath the churn of newer headlines. The valley was sold off in parcels, fenced, and eventually absorbed into a conservation zone. Official maps erased the house, the barn, the road, and even the name, Crenshaw. Only the locals still knew it by another name, the Root Place. But the land never stayed still. Rangers assigned to patrol the area reported strange disturbances in their logs. Soft sinkholes that appeared overnight, animal carcasses found without blood, and a persistent vibration in the ground near the old creek bed. Like the hum of distant machinery. Equipment malfunctioned there more often than anywhere else in the reserve. One ranger, a veteran named Sam Ortega, began to keep his own notes. He was pragmatic, not prone to superstition. But after 2 months on that assignment, he admitted that something about the place listened. In one entry dated September 17th, 2009, Ortega wrote found a circle of bare earth at the northern edge of parcel 47B. No vegetation within 12 feet. Though the soil tests show high fertility, birds avoid it. Heard what sounded like whispering, wind maybe, but cadence too even, came back after dusk, and the air temperature inside the circle was 8 degrees warmer than ambient. Don't like it. 2 weeks later, he stopped filing reports. His truck was found idling at the ranger station, keys still in the ignition, radio humming with static. On the seat lay a small cloth pouch containing dried roots woven together in a spiral. No sign of Ortega. The department closed the zone indefinitely. But closures don't stop curiosity. They only sharpen it. By 2018, internet forums had discovered the story, trading coordinates, blurred photos, and half-true retellings of the girl who never aged. urban explorers began sneaking into the valley, their night vision footage littering the darker corners of YouTube. Most of it was hoax. Then came the video. It was uploaded to a new account. No name, no description, just the title, Ruthfield, MP4. The footage was shaky, filmed from a head-mounted camera. Two voices, male and female, spoke in hushed tones. The date stamp read 10/4/2021. They moved through thick fog, their flashlights catching only the silhouettes of trees. After 4 minutes, the woman said, "We're near the well." The man replied, "No, that's not where it was." The camera turned, and in the beam of light stood a figure. Not close, not far, pale, barefoot, facing away. Her hair hung straight down, almost luminescent in the dark. She appeared to be digging, slowly, rhythmically, hands moving through the soil as if the earth offered no resistance. The woman whispered, "Oh God, she's humming." And then the sound came. That same formless tune, faint at first, swelling until it drowned out their breath, their movement, even the crunch of leaves. The picture blurred, distorted, and the man shouted something, but his words cut out mid-syllable. The final frame was of the ground, a close-up of dark, wet soil, pulsing gently, as though something beneath it was breathing. Then the feed ended. Authorities traced the upload to an abandoned laptop found near the park's north entrance. The hard drive was burned beyond recovery. The original video never resurfaced, but fragments of the audio circulated, analyzed by hobbyists and paranormal researchers alike. Each claimed to hear something different in the hum. A name, a heartbeat, a plea. Yet across every version, one sound remained constant, a faint, childlike voice at the end, whispering just before the tape cuts to silence. "You came back. The root remembers you." There are places the earth itself refuses to forget. The root place is one of them. In the winter of 2024, a geological survey drone from the University of Tennessee captured thermal images of the valley. The researchers weren't looking for folklore, only soil instability. But what the drone returned wasn't a landslide or a fault line. It was a pattern. Buried just beneath the surface of the earth was a network of faint heat signatures. Long, twisting corridors, forming shapes no geological process could have produced. From above, they looked like veins, pulsing faintly with residual warmth. In the center of the pattern, exactly where the Crenshaw house once stood, was a circular void colder than the surrounding ground by nearly 20 degrees. The team assumed an imaging error. They recalibrated, sent another drone, same result, and then the feed went black. 2 days later, the technician who had operated the equipment failed to show up for work. His colleagues thought little of it. People quit all the time. But when they checked the log of his last recorded message, it read only, "It hums even without sound." He was never found. A month later, a local podcast released an episode about Appalachian anomalies, and listeners began reporting strange interference when the root place was mentioned. A low, rhythmic tone, like distant machinery or breath, that bled through headphones and car speakers alike. When one of the hosts slowed the audio by 400%, the waveform revealed something unnerving, a repeating pattern of syllables. Phonetically, it resembled Ruthfield. That same week, the host's home caught fire. Investigators found no cause. The wiring intact, no accelerants detected. The family escaped, but the computer used for editing the episode was melted into a single, fused mass. The more people searched, the deeper the hole became. Digital maps began showing inconsistencies around the old valley. Roads looping back into themselves. Property lines drawn twice, coordinates that wouldn't resolve. A Reddit thread documented these anomalies. But every few days, comments vanished, not deleted, but rewritten, replaced with strings of biblical phrases and old nursery rhymes. Then, in early spring, a man hiking near the boundary of the restricted area found something half buried in a creek bed, a glass jar, sealed with wax. Inside, a photograph. The image was faint, water-streaked, but unmistakable. A young girl standing beside a split oak tree. Her eyes were unfocused, her mouth slightly open, as though caught mid-song. On the back, written in ink so faded it was almost invisible, were the words, "She waits for the second harvest." The man who found it turned it over to local authorities. But when the jar was catalogued, the photograph had changed. The girl was gone. Only the empty tree remained. There are still people who claim to hear her. A voice under the soil, beneath the hum of power lines, woven into the hiss of static when the radio has no station. If you listen long enough, they say, you can hear her asking the same question she whispered to those who came before. What grows from the roots of your blood? And so the story continues. Not in the mountains, not in Kentucky, but anywhere the earth remembers what it was fed. Now tell me, which city are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Because sometimes the roots know when someone is listening. There are stories that stay in the mountains, and there are others that crawl down from them. In the spring of 2025, nearly a century after the first Crenshaw child drew breath, a low fog began creeping into towns that had no business knowing that name. It moved like memory, thin, soundless, always at night. People said it smelled faintly of wet soil and old copper. Pets refused to go outside. Radios filled with static between stations, and within that static, a hum. It began in Knoxville. A woman there, a linguistics professor, claimed to hear a voice beneath the frequencies of her students' recordings. Not feedback, not equipment error, a phrase repeated in a rhythm that felt too human to be coincidence. She slowed the playback. What she heard made her blood run cold. Ruthfield is root. The root is blood. The blood remembers. Within weeks, other reports followed, first from Appalachia, then from as far as Illinois, Maine. Even across the ocean, late-night shortwave listeners began intercepting the same sound. A female voice humming that same tuneless melody, threaded through frequencies no human station occupied. Some said it was the same pitch as the Earth's Schumann resonance, the hum the planet itself produces. By summer, the phenomenon was officially catalogued by amateur researchers as the root field signal. Government agencies denied involvement, though internal memos later leaked showing regional blackouts timed perfectly with the signal's intensification. And still the report spread. In one video, quickly removed but mirrored in dark corners of the internet, a man sits in his basement speaking to the camera, trembling. Behind him, the concrete wall pulses faintly as if something beneath it were breathing. I heard her in the pipes, he says. She was singing the same song my grandmother used to hum. But my grandmother died before I was born. The footage ends abruptly. The wall bursts open like wet clay, and the feed cuts to black. When investigators searched the property, they found no body, only soil, layered thick across the floor, as though it had risen from beneath the foundation. Embedded in that soil were strands of hair and tiny bones, bird, rodent, and something else no one could identify. No official record mentions his name again. Now, even far from the mountains, there are places where the ground moves if you stand too long. Places where the air carries the faint scent of roots that should not be there. Botanists studying invasive vines in urban areas note one that spreads without seed, growing only where human blood has been spilled, in alleys under hospitals, near forgotten graves. Its flowers are pale, almost human in hue. They call it Crenshaw's bloom. But those who know the old story refuse to speak the name. They simply say, "She's growing again." And then sometimes, late at night, if you walk near the soil and listen closely, you can hear it, that low, fragile humming, moving under your feet, under your house, under your heartbeat. The sound of the earth remembering, the sound of Ruthfield waking. Now tell me, if one morning you found roots curling from the seams of your floorboards, warm to the touch, whispering your name, what would you do? Would you dig deeper? Or would you let her in, she end of the root field?